there is a small metal canister, roughly the size and shape of a can of beer, that saved your life the last time you flew on a commercial aircraft. You have never seen it. It lives above your seat, inside the ceiling panel, waiting. If the aircraft were to depressurize at 35,000 feet, if the cabin pressure dropped below the threshold where you could remain conscious, that canister would activate. A chemical reaction inside it would generate oxygen. The mask would drop. You would breathe. The canister generates heat when it activates, a great deal of heat. Up to 500 degrees Fahrenheit. This is, by design, irrelevant when the canister is installed in the ceiling above you, surrounded by fire-resistant materials, doing its job. It is not irrelevant when the canister is loose in a cardboard box, packed in bubble wrap and duct tape, sitting on top of 2 aircraft tires in an unmonitored cargo hold, with no safety cap on its firing pin, labeled as empty when it is not, aboard a flight operated by an airline whose accident rate was 14 times higher than the industry average. On the afternoon of May 11th, 1996, 144 of those canisters were loaded onto ValuJet Flight 592 in exactly those conditions. 10 minutes and 8 seconds after takeoff from Miami International Airport, a flight attendant opened the cockpit door and told the pilots, in her exact words, "completely on fire." 2 minutes and 22 seconds after that, the aircraft struck the Florida Everglades at a nose-down angle of 75 to 80 degrees. All 110 people on board were killed. The wreckage went straight down into the swamp and disappeared below the surface of the water. Rescue divers arrived to find alligators circling the crash site. They recovered less than half the remains of the dead. This is the story of ValuJet Flight 592. It is, on its surface, a story about a box of oxygen canisters labeled incorrectly, but those who study it carefully understand that it is really a story about a country that decided 18 years before this flight that cheaper was better and that the market would sort out the rest. It is a story about what happens when the pressure to cut costs meets the absolute unforgiving physics of fire at altitude. And it is a story about the people who knew for months, who knew for years that something like this was going to happen, and who did not stop it. The canisters were the spark. The system built the fire. To understand ValuJet Flight 592, you have to go back 18 years before the crash, to 1978, when the United States Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act and changed commercial aviation forever. Before deregulation, flying in America was a tightly regulated affair. The civil aeronautics could fly, which routes and what fares they could charge. Competition was limited. Prices were high. Air travel was, for most Americans, a luxury. The Deregulation Act removed those controls. Airlines could now fly wherever they wanted, charge whatever the market would bear, enter and exit routes at will. The promise would drive prices down. More Americans would fly, and the market would sort out which carriers were safe and efficient enough to survive. The promise was largely kept. In the years after deregulation, airfares fell dramatically. Flying became accessible to Americans who had never flown before. New airlines emerged to serve price-sensitive travelers, competing on cost, on simplicity, on the willingness to strip away every amenity that was not absolutely essential. By the early 90s, a new generation of ultra-low-cost carriers was pushing this logic to its furthest limits. Among them was ValuJet Airlines, founded in Atlanta, Georgia in October 1993, with 2 aircraft and a business model built on the premise: if you eliminated everything that was not flight itself, widgets was standards. ValuJet's approach was radical even by the standards of the budget sector. No assigned seats, no meals, no frills of any kind. Aircraft purchased used, already years into their service lives, maintained by outside contractors rather than an in-house maintenance department. The workforce was lean. The management was aggressive. The growth was extraordinary. In its first year, ValuJet flew 2 aircraft. By May of 1996, it was flying 52. In less than 3 years, the airline had grown 26-fold. It was, by any measure, one of the great growth stories of post-deregulation aviation. It was also, by the time of its peak, an airline with an accident and incident rate 14 times higher than the legacy carriers. An airline that had made 129 emergency landings in under 3 years. An airline whose planes had flown 140 times with leaky hydraulic systems, 31 times with malfunctioning weather radar, and at least once with engine rust so severe that the engine caught fire a few months after the rust was missed during a refit. These were not secrets. The FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, knew. The Department of Transportation knew. Internal memos had been circulating for months, questioning whether ValuJet should be allowed to continue operating. In 1995, the United States military had refused to award ValuJet a contract to fly military personnel, citing safety concerns. The FAA's own Inspector General, a woman named Mary Schiavo, had investigated ValuJet and found, in her own words, things like duct tape on the planes, cracked windshields, violations on minimum equipment lists, and FAA regulators who were propping the airline up rather than hitting them with violations. An attempt to revoke ValuJet's operating certificate had been made, and then, in Schiavo's own characterization, simply lost in the maze at the FAA. At the time of the crash, the FAA was in the final stages of a 3-month safety review of ValuJet. The Department of Transportation was preparing to give the airline a clean bill of health. This was the world in which Flight 582 took off on a sunny Saturday afternoon in May. The oxygen generators that killed the passengers of Flight 582 did not arrive on that flight by accident or coincidence. They arrived through a chain of decisions, abbreviations, shortcuts, and failures of communication that stretched back more than 2 months and involved an airline, a maintenance contractor, a shipping clerk, a ramp agent, a first officer, suffer from those slit-eyed leeches that had never clearly addressed what to do with expired oxygen generators when you wanted to ship them somewhere. The story begins in late January 1996, when ValuJet agreed to purchase 3 McDonnell Douglas Medati aircraft. These T-planes were ferried to the Miami maintenance facility of Sabritech Corporation, a contractor that ValuJet had engaged for heavy maintenance on its fleet. Sabritech was under considerable pressure. It had taken on an enormous amount of work for ValuJet, and a company memorandum from April 26, 1996, just 2 weeks before the crash, ordered all maintenance personnel, including management, to work 7 days a week until the 3 Medatis were delivered. No days off. 7 days a week until the aircraft were done. In preparing the Medatis for ValuJet's service, Sabritech mechanics removed the aircraft's chemical oxygen generators, which had reached their expiration dates and needed to be replaced. The work order specified that the generators should be capped with safety caps before being stored or shipped. Safety caps are small plastic covers that fit over the firing pins of the generators. The safety caps were not installed. Multiple mechanics signed off on work cards indicating that the caps had been installed. Multiple mechanics wrote a checkmark in boxes that were supposed to represent verified work, whether or not the work had been done. The generators, 144 of them, still fully loaded with oxygen-producing chemicals, completely capable of activating if their firing pins were struck, were packed into 5 cardboard boxes. Each generator was about the size and shape of a beer can. They were packed loosely. The boxes were sealed with duct tape and bubble wrap. A shipping clerk at Sabritech was given the task of preparing the boxes for transport to Atlanta. He did not know what the items were. He looked at the tags on the generators, which indicated they had been removed as expired parts, and concluded incorrectly, fatally, that expired meant empty. He wrote on the shipping ticket, "Oxy canisters, empty." Oxygen generators are classified as hazardous materials. They are dangerous because they generate extreme heat when activated, because they produce oxygen that feeds fires, and because if they activate in an enclosed space with flammable materials, the results are catastrophic. Federal regulations require that oxygen generators transported as cargo be declared as hazardous materials, be properly capped, and be handled accordingly. ValuJet was not authorized to carry hazardous materials on its aircraft. This was not a technicality or a gray area. It was a clear prohibition derived from the airline's own operating certificate. On the morning of May 11th, 1996, a ValuJet ramp agent and the flight's first officer, Richard Hazen, accepted the shipment of 5 boxes and 3 aircraft tires as company-owned material for loading onto Flight 592. Neither of them paid particular attention to the contents of the boxes. The shipping ticket said oxy canisters, empty, company material. Nothing unusual. The boxes were loaded into the forward cargo compartment of the DC-9. They were placed alongside the tires. They were not secured. They were simply placed in the hold the way packages are placed in a hold, because they were, as far as anyone on the ramp knew, just boxes. Captain Candace Quebec was 35 years old. She had been flying since she was 15, had accumulated 8,928 total flight hours, and had more than 2,000 hours on the DC-9 specifically. She was, by every measure, a skilled and experienced professional. First Officer Richard Hazen was 52, with more than 11,800 total flight hours. The 2 pilots together represented 20,000 plus hours of accumulated experience to 2 pilots. Flight 592 had been scheduled to depart Miami at 1 in the afternoon. It departed an hour and 4 minutes late, at 2:03 after a delay caused by mechanical issues. The delay was not unusual for ValuJet. The airline's maintenance problems were chronic enough that delays had become a feature of the operation rather than an exception. 105 passengers boarded the aircraft. Among them were business travelers, vacationers, families. Among them was an infant traveling as a lap child, the kind of unbooked passenger who does not appear on the official manifest and whose presence would become a quiet tragedy within the larger tragedy when the final death toll was tallied at 110. The afternoon was clear and sunny over Miami. Visibility was essentially over unlimited. At 2:03 and 34 seconds, Flight 582 lifted off from Miami International Airport and began climbing northwest toward Atlanta. Somewhere in the forward cargo hold, one or more of the oxygen generators had already activated or were about to. The exact moment of activation could not be determined. What could be determined was that a fire was already burning in the cargo hold before the aircraft had reached cruising altitude. Possibly before it had even left the ground. The cargo hold of the ValuJet DC-9 was a Class D compartment. Class D cargo holds are designed on a specific safety principle. If a fire breaks out inside, the compartment can be sealed and the fire will extinguish itself due to lack of oxygen. No oxygen, no fire. The design works. It would have worked on this flight. Except that the fire in the hold was feeding itself. The activated generators were producing their own oxygen. The fire had its own fuel supply. The passive suppression design, the one that depended on oxygen running out, was irrelevant. We suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. There were no smoke detectors in the cargo hold. There were national fire suppression systems. Had recommended mandatory smoke detection and fire suppression systems for all Class D cargo holds in 1988 after a similar incident with American Airlines. The FAR had rejected the recommendation, primarily because of the estimated cost. $350 million to retrofit the affected aircraft. There were no smoke detectors. There was no fire suppression. The fire burned, unseen, beneath the passengers' feet. At 14:10 and 12 seconds, approximately 7 minutes after takeoff, the cockpit voice recorder captured the crew beginning to verbalize concerns about electrical problems. What was actually happening was this. The fire in the forward cargo hold had burned through the floor of the aircraft directly above it. At approximately seat rows 5 and 6 on the left-hand side, it had reached the passenger cabin. Washer. At 14:10 and 25 seconds, voices shouting from the passenger cabin were picked up by the recording device's area microphone. Fire! 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 2 seconds later, from somewhere near the cockpit, we're on fire. We're on fire. Flight 592's cockpit interphone system was inoperative that day. This was a known issue, documented in the maintenance log before the flight. When the interphone does not work, flight attendants cannot call the cockpit from the cabin. They have to physically open the cockpit door and enter. A flight attendant opened the cockpit door. She told the crew. We can't get oxygen back there. The cabin is completely on fire. First Officer Hazen immediately transmitted to Miami Approach Control. 5982 needs immediate return to Miami. The controller responded. What kind of problem are you having? Smoke in the cockpit. Smoke in the cabin. The sound rushing air on the recording indicates that someone opened a cockpit window in an attempt to clear the smoke from the flight deck. Miami Approach began vectoring flight 5982 back toward the airport. The controller advised the crew that Opa-locka Airport was 12 o'clock at 15 miles closer than Miami International. Hazen amended his request, closest airport available. At 14:11 and 45 seconds, the cockpit voice recorder stopped. Not faded. Stopped. A sudden interruption lasting 1 minute and 12 seconds, attributed to the loss of electrical power aboard the aircraft. The fire had burned through the wiring. The recorder restarted briefly, then stopped again, then started once more, then fell silent for the last time. Radar data tells the rest of the story. The aircraft went into a steep dive. It dropped more than 6,000 feet in approximately 30 seconds. It leveled off momentarily, a last, perhaps involuntary, perhaps deliberate movement of the controls, and then arsed down into the swamp. At 14:13 and 42 seconds, Flight 5982 struck the Florida Everglades at a nose-down angle of 75 to 80 degrees, right wing down. The aircraft disintegrated on impact and went straight into the muck. Witnesses in a nearby boat described seeing only part of an engine, scattered paper and debris floating on the water. One witness remarked that the airplane seemed to have disappeared upon crashing. It had, almost entirely. The swamp swallowed most of it, 10 minutes and 8 seconds from takeoff to a crater in a Florida swamp. 110 people, gone. What followed was one of the most difficult accident investigations in the history of the National Transportation Safety Board. Not because of analytical complexity, but because of physical conditions. The crash site was in the Francis S. Taylor Wildlife Management Area of the Florida Everglades. The nearest road was a quarter of a mile from the impact point. The water at the crash site was deep and murky. Alligators were a constant presence. The wreckage was scattered across a large area, most of it submerged, much of it fragmented beyond recognition by the violence of the impact and the fire that had preceded it. Investigators arrived with divers, helicopters, airboats, and sharpshooters. They began the methodical process of recovering wreckage from a swamp that did not give up its contents easily. The flight data recorder was recovered relatively quickly. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered in damaged condition, but still readable. Together, they provided the timeline of the final flight. The physical wreckage provided the evidence of what had happened in the cargo hold. Investigators found evidence of intense heat and fire concentrated in the forward cargo area. We suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. They found evidence that the fire had burned upward through the cabin floor at rows 5 and 6, consistent with the flight attendant's report. They found evidence that the fire had damaged or severed the aircraft's control cables, which ran beneath the cabin floor, which is why the aircraft had become uncontrollable in the final moments. They did not find all of the dead. Ultimately, investigators recovered less than 70% of the remains of the 110 people on board. The swamp had kept what it had taken. As the physical investigation proceeded in the Everglades, a parallel investigation traced the paper trail of the oxygen generators, how they had gotten from Sabritech's maintenance facility to ValuJet's cargo hold. What investigators found was not a single catastrophic failure, but a cascade of small ones, each individually survivable, collectively fatal. Sabritech mechanics had not installed safety caps. Multiple individuals had signed work cards attesting to work that had not been done. The shipping clerk had labeled the generators as empty when he had no basis for that conclusion. The manifest had left the boxes unclassified as hazardous materials. The ValuJ ramp agent had accepted the shipment without adequate inspection. The first officer had signed for it without examining the contents. Nobody along the entire chain, from the Sabtech maintenance floor to the cargo hold, had stopped to ask the basic question, what exactly is in these boxes, and is it safe to put them on a passenger airplane? But the investigators did not stop with Sabtech and ValuJet. because the paper trail did not end there. It extended to the FAR. The agency's oversight of ValuJet had been inadequate. The airline's safety record had been poor for years. Internal FAR documents showed that inspectors had identified problems at ValuJet repeatedly and had, in multiple instances, chosen to work around them rather than enforce corrective action. The FAR had been aware of concerns about hazardous materials handling at airline maintenance contractors and had not acted. The NTSB's previous recommendation for fire detection and suppression systems in cargo holds had been sitting unaddressed for 8 years. Most significantly, the FAR had been in the final stages of a comprehensive safety review of ValuJet when the crash occurred. That review was on track to give the airline a clean bill of health. Within weeks of that conclusion, 110 people were dead in a Florida swamp. Mary Schiavo, the Inspector General who had tried to have ValuJet grounded, had found duct tape and cracked windows and minimum equipment violations. She had found FAR regulators more interested in helping the airline grow than in enforcing the regulations it was violating. She had tried, through official channels, to shut down an airline she believed was unsafe. The attempt had been, in her own words, lost in the maze at the FAR. The FAR's dual mandate to simultaneously regulate safety and promote the growth of the aviation industry was not a secret, it was the law. The agency was required by its founding statute to do both things at once. The tension between those two imperatives had been manageable when the industry was dominated by large carriers with mature safety cultures. It became untenable when a new generation of cost-cutting carriers was being created faster than the oversight apparatus could adapt. The week after Flight 592, Transportation Secretary Federico Penna announced he would ask Congress to change the FAR's mandate to focus only on safety. The language was subsequently enacted. The FAR's promotional mandate was removed. It was changed because 110 people died in a swamp. The legal consequences were extensive, complicated, and ultimately unsatisfying to the victims' families. Sabratech Corporation was criminally prosecuted, the first American aviation company to be convicted for its role in an airline crash. Miami-Dade prosecutors charged the company with 110 counts of manslaughter and 110 counts of third-degree murder. Federal prosecutors added 23 criminal charges related to hazardous materials handling. What happened next took several years and multiple appeals. The murder and manslaughter charges were eventually dropped. The federal hazardous materials convictions were largely overturned on appeal because the court determined that federal law at the time did not support criminal penalties for reckless violations of hazmat regulations. The company was convicted on charges of failing to properly train employees. The company was fined approximately $1 million and then declared no assets and paid nothing. Sabratech went out of business in 1999. 3 individual employees were also charged. 2 were acquitted. 1, a mechanic named Mauro Ociel Valenzuela Reyes, fled the country while facing federal charges in 1999. As of 2018, the FBI was still offering $10,000 for information about his whereabouts. ValuJet was grounded by the FAR on June 16, 1996. It resumed flying in September with a greatly reduced fleet. Its highest-paying customers never returned. In 1997, ValuJet merged with the much smaller Airtran Airways and changed its name. The ValuJet brand, too toxic to survive, ceased to exist. Airtran was later acquired by Southwest Airlines in 2011. The families of the dead were not satisfied by any of this. They had wanted ValuJet prosecuted. The airline whose aircraft burned and whose contractor had loaded illegal cargo was never criminally charged. They had wanted individuals held accountable. The person most directly responsible for mislabeling the generators had fled and was never found. They had wanted the FAR to answer for its years of inadequate oversight. The agency changed its mandate, but no FAR official faced criminal consequences. The changes that followed Flight 592 were real and lasting, even if they came too late for the 110. The most immediate and consequential change was mandatory fire detection and suppression in cargo holds. In February 1998, the FAA issued standards requiring all Class D cargo compartments to be converted to holds equipped with smoke detection and fire suppression systems. Airlines worldwide upgraded their cargo holds by the early 2000s. This change, had it been in place in May 1996, would almost certainly have saved Flight 592. A smoke detector in the forward hold would have alerted the crew to the fire before it burned through the cabin floor. A fire suppression system would have bought time for an emergency landing. The fire that killed 110 people would have been manageable, perhaps survivable. The NTSB had recommended this change in 1988. The FAA had rejected it because of the $350 million cost. It was ultimately implemented anyway, after a much larger cost had been paid. Hazardous materials training and oversight for airline maintenance contractors was substantially reformed. The regulations governing the labeling, packaging, and shipment of hazardous materials as air cargo were tightened. The requirements for airline operators to oversee their maintenance contractors were made more rigorous and more enforceable. The assumption that market competition would enforce safety, that airlines with poor safety records would be driven out of business by consumer choice before they could cause mass casualties had been tested and found false. Passengers do not have access to an airline's incident rate before they book a ticket. The market does not reliably punish safety failures until after people are dead. Regulatory oversight, robust and insulated from the dual pressures of industry promotion and budget constraints, turned out to be the actual mechanism by which aviation safety is maintained. Not the market, not competition. The slow, unglamorous work of inspectors checking work cards and tracking incident rates and having the authority to ground an airline that is not safe enough to fly. 3 years after the crash, on the anniversary of May 11th, 1999, a memorial was dedicated in the Florida Everglades. It stands just north of the Tamiami Trail Highway, about 12 miles west of Chrome Avenue. Slit-eyed leeches, pointing toward the crash site 12 miles away. It consists of 110 concrete pillars. It was designed by students from the American Institute of Architecture students. It was built by local contractors, masons, and labor unions, who donated their work. In 2013, a local resident slogging through the sawgrass found, in the same general area as the crash, a partially melted gold pendant. The Everglades keep their secrets. 17 years after the crash, there were still things in that water that had not come out. Let us return, at the end, to the canister, the size and shape of a beer can. It still lives above your seat on every commercial aircraft you will ever fly. It is still there, waiting, doing its job of keeping you alive if the cabin pressure drops. What has changed is everything around it. The mechanics who remove expired generators today work under training requirements that did not exist in 1996. The work cards they sign off on are audited with a rigor that was not present in 1996. The shipping manifests that accompany generators are reviewed under regulations that did not have teeth in 1996. The suffer from those they pass through are equipped with smoke detectors and fire suppression systems that were not there in 1996. The cargo hold beneath your feet on today's commercial flight is a fundamentally different safety environment than the one in which those 144 canisters sat on a sunny Saturday afternoon in Miami. Not because the canisters changed, because the price of the failure was paid, and the industry, chastened and regulated and reformed, built a better system around them. This is the cost of cheap, not the cheap ticket. The ticket was cheap because someone somewhere in a chain of decisions chose not to spend the money on the safety cap, chose not to spend the money on the smoke detector, chose not to spend the money on the fire suppressor, chose not to spend the money on the training. We suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. Chose not to spend the money on work card before it became a death sentence for 110 people on a Saturday afternoon in May. The price of cheap, in May of 1996, was 110 lives and a crater in the Florida Everglades that gave back less than 70% of the dead. 110 concrete pillars in the Everglades, one for each person on board, each one pointing toward the place where an aircraft went down because a box of canisters was labeled empty when it was not, because a safety cap was not installed, because a work card was not read, because a manifest was not checked, because a regulator did not act. We sacked since because a dual mandate had created a conflict of interest that had been building for 18 years because the price of the ticket was set before the price of the safety was paid. We suffer from those slit-eyed leeches. They were ordinary people on an ordinary flight on a Saturday afternoon in 1996, going to Atlanta, which is where the flight was supposed to go. We remember them, all 110 of them. ValuJet Flight 582, May 11th, 1996. The flight that proved there is no such thing as a free ticket.